Welcome back to another journey through the quieter corridors of history. Tonight, we're stepping into one of the most haunting and mysterious chapters of the medieval world, the time of the Black Death, when cities fell silent except for the sound of cartwheels carrying the dead, and strange bird-like figures moved through empty streets like harbingers from another world. Imagine yourself settling back into the comfort of your warm bed, surrounded by the safety of modern medicine and sanitation. As you listen, let your mind drift back 7 centuries to a time when death arrived without warning, when the very air seemed poisoned, and when the healers themselves became symbols of fear and desperation. Tonight, you'll walk in the leather boots of a medieval plague doctor, feeling the weight of their bizarre costume, breathing the herb-scented air through their peculiar beaked masks. You'll discover why these enigmatic figures, meant to bring healing, often brought only false hope, and sometimes hastened the very death they sought to prevent. Close your eyes and let yourself be transported to the cobblestone streets of 14th century Europe, where the boundary between medicine and superstition blurred like shadows in candlelight, and where survival depended on luck far more than knowledge. The morning air in Avignon hangs thick with the scent of burning herbs and something else, something you've learned not to think about too deeply. You are a plague doctor, and today, like every day for the past 6 months, you must don your leather armor against death itself. Imagine yourself reaching for the heavy, waxed leather robe that hangs by your door. The material is thick, nearly impermeable, treated with various oils and waxes that are supposed to protect you from the corrupted air that carries the pestilence. But as you lift it, you can already feel its weight, pounds of leather that will rest on your shoulders for the next 12 hours. The morning is already warm, and summer in southern France promises no mercy. The robe reaches nearly to your ankles, covering every inch of your body. Beneath it you wear multiple layers of linen undergarments, also treated with aromatic substances. The theory, such as it is, suggests that the thick barrier will prevent the corrupt vapors from penetrating to your skin. In practice, you know that within an hour of beginning your rounds, you'll be swimming in your own perspiration. But the robe is only the beginning of your daily ordeal. Next comes the hat, a wide-brimmed leather affair that shadows your face and helps support the weight of what comes next. The most distinctive and disturbing piece of your equipment, the mask. Imagine lifting this bizarre creation, crafted to resemble the elongated beak of some great bird. The leather is dark, nearly black, and the glass eyepieces gleam with an otherworldly quality that frightens even you, sometimes, when you catch your reflection in a shop window. The beak extends nearly 6 inches from your face, stuffed with a carefully prepared mixture of dried herbs, aromatic woods, and crushed flowers. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, juniper berries, and sometimes more exotic ingredients when you can afford them. Cinnamon, cloves, or even small pieces of unicorn horn, though you suspect the apothecary who sold it to you was lying about its authenticity. As you secure the mask over your head, adjusting the leather straps that hold it in place, your world immediately becomes confined and strange. Your field of vision narrows dramatically, limited to what you can see through those small glass windows. The herbs inside the beak create a constant, overwhelming scent that makes your eyes water and your head ache within minutes. Every breath is a struggle, filtered through layers of dried vegetation that seem to grow more oppressive as the day progresses. But you understand the theory behind this torment. The corrupt air, the miasma, that carries the plague is believed to enter through the nose and mouth. By breathing only through this filter of protective herbs, you hope to transform the poisoned atmosphere into something your body can safely process. The long beak also keeps you at a distance from your patients, preventing them from breathing directly onto you. With your leather gloves, thick, treated, reaching past your wrists, you pick up your wooden staff. Every plague doctor carries one. It serves multiple purposes: to examine patients without touching them directly, to move clothing or bedding, to keep desperate family members at a safe distance, and sometimes, sadly, to defend yourself from those who blame you for the deaths that seem to follow in your wake. Now, imagine stepping out into the street. The familiar weight of your equipment makes every movement deliberate and slow. Your breathing, already labored by the herb-stuffed mask, becomes more difficult as you begin walking. The summer sun, which seemed pleasant when you glimpsed it through your window, now becomes your enemy. The dark leather absorbs heat with merciless efficiency. Within moments, you feel the first trickle of sweat running down your spine. The multiple layers of clothing beneath your robe begin to cling to your skin. Your feet, encased in heavy leather boots that reach to mid-calf, begin to feel hot and confined. But these discomforts are minor compared to what awaits you in the sick rooms of the city. The streets themselves tell the story of the plague's advance through the community. Houses that once buzzed with activity now stand silent, their shutters closed, red crosses painted on their doors to warn others away. You pass a group of grave diggers heading toward the city walls, their cart loaded with bodies wrapped in whatever cloth their families could spare. The constant traffic of death has worn deep ruts in the cobblestones. As you walk, children peer at you from behind partially opened doors, their eyes wide with fear. To them, you are not a healer but a harbinger, your bizarre appearance more frightening than comforting. Adults cross themselves and hurry past, averting their eyes from your glass-windowed gaze. You have become a living symbol of the catastrophe that has befallen their world. Your first patient of the day lives in a narrow house near the market square. The building, once prosperous, now emanates an odor that penetrates even your herb-filtered breathing apparatus. As you climb the wooden stairs, your staff tapping against each step, you can hear the sounds of suffering from within. Labored breathing, occasional moans, and the quiet sobbing of family members who know their loved one is beyond help. In the shadow of the great papal palace in Avignon, where the massive stone walls seem to offer protection from the chaos consuming Europe, lives a man whose reputation as a healer extends far beyond the plague-ravaged city. His name is Guy de Chauliac, and he carries the weight of being personal physician to Pope Clement VI during the most catastrophic medical crisis in recorded history. Imagine yourself in the year 1348, standing in the well-appointed study of this remarkable man. The room reflects both medieval scholarship and desperate innovation. Shelves lined with ancient medical texts, tables covered with anatomical drawings, and scattered notes documenting his increasingly frantic observations of the plague's progress through the papal court and the city beyond. Neither Chauliac is no ordinary physician. Born in the small village of Chauliac in the Auvergne region of France, sometime around 1300, he has spent decades accumulating knowledge that places him among the most learned medical minds of his era. His education took him from the University of Toulouse to Montpellier, then to Paris, and finally to Bologna, where he studied under some of Europe's most respected anatomists and surgeons. Unlike many of his contemporaries who rely solely on ancient texts, Chauliac has performed numerous dissections and surgical procedures, giving him an understanding of human anatomy that few possess. But now, in the autumn of 1348, all of his learning seems inadequate against the horror that has swept into Avignon like a malevolent tide. The plague arrived in the city during the spring, carried by merchants traveling the trade routes from the east. At first, it claimed victims slowly, almost tentatively, allowing the population to hope it might be contained. But by summer, death had accelerated to a pace that defied comprehension. In his private chambers each evening, by the flickering light of oil lamps, Chauliac records his observations with the methodical precision of a natural philosopher. His writings reveal a man torn between scientific curiosity and growing despair. He describes the disease with unprecedented clinical detail, noting how it manifests in two distinct forms. The first, which he calls the more merciful variety, begins with fever and the appearance of swellings, buboes, in the neck, armpits and groin. Patients afflicted with this form might survive for 5 to 7 days, giving families time to prepare and physicians opportunity to attempt treatments. The second form terrifies him more deeply. It strikes with sudden fever and the spitting of blood, and victims rarely survive beyond 3 days. Sometimes they die within hours of the first symptoms appearing. Chauliac writes of watching robust men take to their beds in the morning and expire before sunset, their lungs filling with blood so rapidly that they drown in their own bodies. As personal physician to the Pope, Chauliac occupies a unique position during this crisis. The papal court has become an island of relative safety within the plague-ravaged city, protected by wealth, isolation, and the constant burning of aromatic woods that are believed to purify the air. Pope Clement VI has ordered fires to be kept burning continuously in his chambers, filling the papal apartments with smoke from cedar, juniper, and other aromatic substances. The theory, which Chauliac supports despite his growing doubts about much of conventional medical wisdom, suggests that these vapors will drive away the corrupted air that carries the pestilence. But Chauliac's position also forces him to witness the plague's progress through every level of society. When summoned to treat members of the papal household, he sees how the disease strikes without regard for station or sanctity. Cardinals fall as easily as servants, their purple robes offering no more protection than the rough wool of peasants. The Pope himself lives in constant fear, and Chauliac must balance his medical recommendations with the psychological need to maintain hope in the Church's highest circles. The physician's daily routine during the plague years reveals the desperate measures of a learned man confronting the limits of his knowledge. Each morning, he reviews the cases from the previous day, noting which treatments appeared to provide relief and which seemed to hasten death. His records show a methodical mind attempting to discern patterns in what appears to be random devastation. He experiments with various therapeutic approaches, many borrowed from ancient authorities like Galen and Avicenna, others emerging from his own desperate innovations. One day might find him preparing complex herbal remedies, grinding exotic spices and rare minerals into powders that he hopes might restore the balance of his patients' bodily humors. The next might see him wielding surgical instruments, attempting to lance buboes with techniques he develops through trial and error. Chauliac becomes particularly fascinated by the astrological aspects of the plague's timing. Medieval medical theory holds that disease results from the influence of celestial bodies on earthly conditions, and he spends hours calculating planetary alignments and consulting astrological charts. His notes reveal a man searching for cosmic explanations for terrestrial catastrophe, hoping that if he can understand why the stars have permitted this suffering, he might discover how to appeal to them for relief. The psychological toll of his position becomes evident in his increasingly personal observations. He writes of sleepless nights spent wondering whether his treatments help or harm his patients. The classical medical authorities he has studied for decades recommend bloodletting, purging, and the application of hot poultices to encourage buboes to burst and drain. Yet he watches patients grow weaker with each bleeding, sees them expire in agony as infected swellings are lanced, and begins to question everything he has been taught. One particularly haunting passage in his chronicles describes his treatment of a young cardinal who contracted the plague in late summer. The man, barely 30 years old and previously robust, developed the telltale swellings and fever. Following established medical practice, Chauliac prescribed a series of bloodlettings to reduce the patient's excessive humors. But instead of improving, the cardinal grew progressively weaker. Desperate, Chauliac tried increasingly aggressive treatments, hot poultices, purgatives, even experimental compounds containing powdered pearls and gold, believed to counteract poison. The cardinal died on the 6th day of his illness, and Chauliac records his growing suspicion that the treatments themselves might have contributed to the death. This possibility haunts him more than the disease itself. The idea that learned physicians, armed with centuries of accumulated wisdom, might be accelerating their patients' deaths represents a crisis of faith that extends beyond medicine into the very foundations of medieval knowledge. As autumn deepens and the plague's grip on Avignon tightens, Chauliac begins to document a phenomenon that disturbs him even more than the disease's medical aspects: its social and psychological effects. He watches as the normal structures of civilized life collapse under the weight of mortality. Families abandon sick relatives, fleeing to the countryside in hopes of escaping contamination. Priests refuse to administer last rites, terrified of approaching the dying. Physicians, including some of his own colleagues, abandon their practices and flee the city. Yet Chauliac remains, driven by a combination of professional duty, intellectual curiosity, and perhaps a form of fatalism. He continues treating patients, continues documenting symptoms, continues searching for effective remedies. His commitment to remaining at his post during the plague's worst months will later be recorded as one of the few bright moments of courage and dedication in an era marked by widespread abandonment of responsibility. In his private moments, Chauliac grapples with profound questions that extend beyond medicine. His writings reveal a man confronting the possibility that human knowledge, no matter how carefully accumulated and refined, might be fundamentally inadequate against certain forms of suffering. The plague has stripped away his confidence in established authorities and forced him to confront the possibility that much of what he has spent his life learning might be wrong. But rather than succumbing to despair, he transforms this crisis into an opportunity for innovation. His plague chronicles represent some of the most detailed clinical observations of the 14th century, documenting symptoms, treatments, and outcomes with a precision that will prove valuable to future generations of physicians. He begins developing new surgical techniques, experimenting with different approaches to wound care, and questioning assumptions about anatomy and disease that have remained unchallenged for centuries. As winter approaches and the plague's intensity finally begins to diminish, not through any human intervention, but apparently through its own mysterious cycles, Chauliac starts to synthesize his observations into broader theories about disease and treatment. His later writings will reflect a more humble, empirical approach to medicine, one that values careful observation over adherence to ancient authority. The man who emerges from the plague years is transformed. The confident scholar who once relied on classical texts has become a more cautious practitioner who trusts his own observations over inherited wisdom. His later medical treatise, Chirurgia Magna, will reflect this transformation, emphasizing practical experience over theoretical knowledge and honest acknowledgement of medicine's limitations over claims of certain cures. In the quiet of his study, as the fires continue burning to purify the air and the sounds of a slowly recovering city drift through his windows, Guy de Chauliac represents both the tragedy and the potential of human learning. He embodies a generation of scholars forced to confront the inadequacy of their knowledge, yet determined to build something better from the ruins of their certainty. Beneath the modern streets of London, workers excavating for new construction projects occasionally make discoveries that transport us directly back to the darkest chapters of medieval history. In quiet moments, archaeologists carefully brush soil from human remains that tell stories of desperate times. Mass graves hastily dug when individual burials became impossible, when the normal rituals of death collapsed under the sheer weight of mortality. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of one such excavation site, perhaps near what was once the East Smithfield Cemetery in medieval London. The rectangular pit before you stretches 20 feet in length and nearly as wide, its carefully laid stone walls still visible after more than 6 centuries. This is one of the emergency plague cemeteries created during the Black Death, and its contents offer a haunting glimpse into how communities attempted to maintain dignity and order even as their world collapsed around them. The archaeological evidence from these plague pits reveals details that written records often omit. Unlike the chaotic mass graves one might expect, many of these burials show careful planning and deliberate organization. Bodies were laid out in neat rows, often wrapped in shrouds, sometimes accompanied by small personal items, a wooden cross, a simple ring, a pouch containing herbs believed to offer protection in the afterlife. Even in crisis, medieval communities struggled to preserve the sacred rituals that gave meaning to death. But the mystery deepens when archaeologists examine the soil layers within these graves. Between the neat rows of bodies, they find evidence of repeated consecration ceremonies, layers of blessed earth, scattered flower petals preserved in the clay, and sometimes small lead tokens bearing religious symbols. The bones themselves tell stories that illuminate the plague's progression through different segments of medieval society. Analysis of skeletal remains from plague pits reveals that the disease struck across all social classes, but not necessarily in the ways contemporary accounts might suggest. Some graves contain evidence of hasty preparation, bodies buried in whatever clothing they wore when they died, with no time for the careful washing and wrapping that normally preceded burial. Others show signs of loving attention even under desperate circumstances, bodies carefully arranged, hands positioned in prayer, shrouds made from precious cloth that families sacrificed to honor their dead. One of the most intriguing archaeological mysteries involves the strange objects found scattered throughout plague burial sites. Excavations have uncovered thousands of small lead amulets, many bearing symbols that combine Christian imagery with much older pre-Christian protective signs. These amulets appear to have been manufactured specifically during plague years, suggesting a thriving industry in protective charms that drew upon every available tradition of spiritual defense. The most common of these plague amulets bears the image of Saint Roch, a figure who became intimately associated with protection from pestilence. But alongside traditional religious imagery, archaeologists find symbols that reach back to ancient Roman and Celtic traditions. Spiral patterns believed to confuse evil spirits, animal figures thought to possess protective power, and complex geometric designs whose meanings have been lost to time. Perhaps most mysteriously, many of these amulets show signs of deliberate damage, scratches, burns, or deliberate breakage that appears to have occurred before burial. Some scholars suggest this represents a final ritual act, the symbolic destruction of protective objects that failed to save their owners, released to accompany the dead on their journey to whatever lay beyond. The development of plague-specific rituals extended far beyond burial practices. Archaeological evidence from medieval homes reveals fascinating adaptations of daily life during epidemic periods. Excavations of houses from plague-affected areas show evidence of systematic modifications designed to protect inhabitants from corrupted air. Doorways were narrowed with additional stonework, creating smaller openings that could more easily be sealed with cloth soaked in protective substances. Windows were reduced in size or blocked entirely, leaving only small gaps that could be filtered with burning herbs. Within these modified homes, archaeologists find evidence of elaborate purification rituals. Floor layers from plague years contain unusual concentrations of ash from specific woods, juniper, cedar, and rowan, believed to possess protective properties. Hidden beneath floorboards and within wall spaces, excavators discover caches of protective herbs, some still identifiable after 6 centuries. Dried lavender, rosemary, rue, and angelica, often arranged in careful patterns that suggest ritual significance beyond simple fumigation. One of the most haunting discoveries involves children's burials from plague periods. Archaeological sites consistently reveal that families developed special protective rituals for their youngest members. Children's graves often contain unusual arrangements of objects, wooden toys carved with protective symbols, small leather pouches containing herbs, and sometimes elaborate chalk drawings on stone surfaces that seem to represent prayers or protective spells written in symbols rather than words. Contemporary documents hint at the purpose of these massive purification fires. Chronicles describe communities gathering to burn objects associated with the plague dead, clothing, bedding, personal possessions. But the archaeological evidence suggests something more complex. The careful arrangement of burned materials and the presence of expensive imported substances indicate that these were not simply practical disposal efforts, but elaborate ritual ceremonies designed to cleanse entire communities of spiritual contamination. The most intriguing aspect of these community purification sites is their timing. Carbon dating and stratigraphic analysis suggest that many of these massive burning ceremonies occurred not at the height of plague outbreaks, but during the periods of apparent recovery between waves of disease. This timing implies that medieval communities understood something about the cyclical nature of epidemic disease and developed preventive rituals designed to protect against future outbreaks rather than simply respond to current ones. Archaeological investigation of medieval religious sites reveals another layer of plague-era ritual adaptation. Churches and monasteries from plague periods show evidence of dramatic modifications to their internal layouts. Altars were moved, prayer spaces reconfigured, and entirely new ritual areas created specifically for plague-related religious observances. These modifications often included the installation of permanent incense-burning stations, special areas for the blessing of protective amulets, and dedicated spaces for the consecration of medicinal herbs. Perhaps most mysteriously, several medieval religious sites contain what archaeologists call plague stones. Large stone slabs carved with complex symbolic designs that appear to have been created specifically during epidemic periods. These stones often bear combinations of Christian and pre-Christian imagery so intertwined that scholars debate whether they represent syncretic religious practices or desperate attempts to invoke protection from every available spiritual tradition. Archaeological analysis of medieval cemeteries reveals that plague burials often included objects whose significance extends beyond simple grave goods. Excavations consistently uncover what appear to be protective barriers placed between plague victims and the surrounding earth, layers of specific types of stone, arrangements of metal objects, and sometimes elaborate geometric patterns created from organic materials that have left traces in the soil chemistry. One recurring mystery involves the discovery of plague burials, where bodies appear to have been deliberately repositioned after initial burial. Skeletal analysis suggests that graves were reopened and bodies rearranged, sometimes months or years after death. This practice has no precedent in normal medieval burial customs and appears to be another plague-specific ritual development. The repositioning often places bodies in symbolic arrangements, hands repositioned to hold objects, faces turned towards specific directions, or multiple bodies arranged in geometric patterns. The archaeological record suggests that medieval communities developed an entirely new vocabulary of protective and purification rituals during plague years, practices that combined traditional religious observance with innovative responses to unprecedented crisis. These rituals left physical traces that continue to puzzle archaeologists. Buried caches of protective objects, modified building layouts, mass purification sites, and burial practices that defied conventional tradition. As excavation work continues at medieval sites across Europe, each new discovery adds another piece to the complex puzzle of how ordinary people attempted to understand and defend against a catastrophe that defied all existing frameworks of knowledge. The archaeological evidence reveals communities that refuse to surrender to despair, instead creating new forms of meaning and protection from whatever materials and traditions they could adapt to their desperate circumstances. High above the chaos of plague-ravaged Florence, in the marble halls of the Palazzo Vecchio, the city's wealthiest families have transformed their grand residences into fortified islands of luxury and isolation. Here, behind walls thick enough to muffle the sounds of suffering from the streets below, the medieval elite have created a world that operates by entirely different rules than those governing the lives of ordinary citizens. Imagine yourself climbing the broad stone steps to one such palace, perhaps the home of a wealthy banking family whose fortune has been built on trade routes that now carry death as readily as silk and spices. The massive wooden doors, normally open to display the family's wealth and hospitality, now remain barred except for carefully controlled entrances. Guards stationed at every access point carry not weapons, but burning censers, filling the air around the building with clouds of aromatic smoke believed to purify the atmosphere before contamination can enter. Inside these palatial refuges, the wealthy have transformed the very air they breathe into something entirely different from what fills the lungs of their less fortunate neighbors. Every room burns with fires of expensive aromatic woods, cedar from Lebanon, sandalwood from distant India, precious aloe wood whose cost exceeds the annual income of most craftsmen. The smoke from these fires creates a perpetual haze that turns the interior spaces into something resembling a temple dedicated to the worship of purified air. The daily routine of a wealthy merchant family during the plague reveals the profound disparities that wealth can create, even in the face of universal catastrophe. While common citizens struggle to obtain basic foodstuffs as trade networks collapse and markets close, the elite dine on delicacies imported at enormous expense from regions not yet touched by pestilence. Their tables groan under the weight of spiced meats, exotic fruits preserved in honey, and wines aged in cellars that have been sealed and fumigated according to the most advanced theories of air purification. But beyond mere sustenance, these families have access to protective measures that exist only in the realm of the fantastically wealthy. Their personal physicians are not the desperate plague doctors who wander the streets in their bizarre costumes, but learned men trained at the finest universities, equipped with the most expensive instruments and rarest medicinal substances. These elite healers prescribe treatments that involve powdered pearls dissolved in wine, potions containing gold leaf, and aromatic baths prepared with oils whose individual components cost more than most families earn in months. The contrast between their experience and that of ordinary citizens becomes most stark in their approach to the plague's social dimensions. While common families watch helplessly as the disease tears through their neighborhoods, the wealthy have the resources to create entirely separate social networks. They host elaborate dinner parties for other survivors of their class, gathering in perfumed chambers where the conversation focuses not on the daily struggle for survival, but on philosophical discussions of the plague's meaning, the latest artistic productions inspired by the crisis, or plans for rebuilding once the catastrophe passes. These gatherings reveal the psychological buffers that wealth provides against the plague's psychological impact. Surrounded by beauty, protected by multiple layers of servants and security, insulated from direct contact with suffering, the elite can maintain a sense of normality that borders on the surreal. Musicians perform in their halls while bodies are collected in the streets below. Poets recite verses about the temporary nature of earthly troubles, while common citizens abandon their sick relatives in desperate attempts to save themselves. The architectural modifications that wealthy families make to their homes during plague years represent a fascinating intersection of medieval medical theory and unlimited resources. Entire wings of palaces are sealed off and converted into what amount to medieval clean rooms. These spaces feature multiple layers of filtration, chambers where entering visitors must pause while servants burn purifying substances around them, antechambers where clothing is fumigated with expensive aromatics, and finally, the inner sanctums, where family members reside in air so thick with protective vapors that it sometimes becomes difficult to see clearly across a room. The most elaborate of these protective installations involve entire floors dedicated to air purification. Teams of servants maintain banks of braziers, burning different combinations of protective substances at precisely timed intervals. The theory, developed by the most learned physicians money can hire, suggests that different types of corruption require different types of purification, and that the ideal protective atmosphere results from the careful combination of multiple aromatic defenses layered and timed according to complex astronomical calculations. Within these perfumed sanctuaries, wealthy families develop elaborate daily rituals designed to maintain their spiritual and physical purity. Morning routines might involve baths in water infused with rare herbs, followed by the application of protective unguents made from exotic ingredients. Clothing is selected not merely for beauty, but for its purported protective properties. Silk because it is smooth and non-porous. Furs from specific animals believed to possess natural resistance to corruption, and jewelry incorporating gems thought to radiate protective influences. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of elite plague experience involves their relationship with their servants and the broader community. Wealthy families require enormous staffs to maintain their elaborate protective systems. Servants to tend the fires, specialists to prepare purified foods, guards to control access, and physicians to monitor their health. Yet they must somehow protect themselves from the very people upon whom they depend for survival. This creates a complex hierarchy of isolation within isolation. The most essential servants, personal attendants, food preparers, medical specialists, are required to undergo elaborate purification procedures before being permitted into the family's presence. They must bathe in aromatic waters, dress in specially treated clothing, and often submit to medical examinations to ensure they show no signs of infection. Some wealthy households go so far as to house these essential servants within the palace itself, creating a closed ecosystem designed to eliminate any contact with the contaminated outside world. The psychological impact of this extreme isolation reveals itself in the surviving records of wealthy families from plague periods. Private letters and diary entries describe a growing sense of unreality, a feeling of existing in a bubble that seems increasingly disconnected from the world beyond their walls. Some family members report difficulty determining whether the plague is worsening or improving because their only information comes through layers of servants and intermediaries, all of whom have been instructed to minimize reports that might cause distress. This information filtering creates its own form of suffering among the elite. While they are physically protected from the plague's worst effects, they become psychologically tormented by uncertainty. Rumors and half-truths circulate through their isolated social networks, growing more elaborate and frightening with each retelling. Stories emerge of entire cities dying, of the plague spreading to regions previously thought safe, of social collapse so complete that normal commerce and communication have ceased entirely. The wealthy respond to this uncertainty by developing increasingly elaborate theories about the plague's origins and meaning. With unlimited time for contemplation and access to the finest libraries and most learned advisors, they craft complex philosophical explanations for the catastrophe. Some embrace astrological theories that blame the alignment of planets for corrupting the Earth's atmosphere. Others develop religious interpretations that cast the plague as divine punishment for humanity's sins, while positioning themselves as the righteous remnant chosen to preserve civilization. These theories often lead to grandiose plans for post-plague reconstruction. Wealthy families spend hours designing ideal cities that will be built once the catastrophe passes, communities organized according to principles learned from the current crisis. Their plans invariably feature extensive provisions for controlling air quality, managing population density, and maintaining the social hierarchies that have allowed them to survive when others perished. As months pass and the plague's grip on their cities gradually loosens, the elite begin to venture beyond their perfumed chambers in carefully controlled expeditions. These excursions, undertaken with elaborate protective precautions, reveal to them the full extent of the devastation that has occurred while they remained in isolation. Entire neighborhoods stand empty, their inhabitants dead or fled. Markets that once bustled with activity have become ghost towns where weeds grow between abandoned stalls. The contrast between their preserved world and the devastation surrounding it creates a complex mixture of guilt, relief, and opportunity. While they mourn the human cost of the catastrophe, they also recognize the economic possibilities it has created. Property values have collapsed, creating opportunities for expansion. Labor shortages have increased their relative economic power. The deaths of competitors and the disruption of established trade networks open possibilities for new forms of wealth accumulation. Yet the psychological impact of extreme isolation during the plague years leaves permanent changes in the elite mindset. Many never fully trust the outside world again, maintaining modified versions of their protective measures long after the immediate crisis passes. They continue to favor social networks composed exclusively of other plague survivors of their class, people who shared their particular form of survival experience. Some develop what amounts to survivor's guilt, questioning whether their safety was purchased through the suffering of those who served them during the crisis. The legacy of the elite plague experience extends far beyond individual psychological changes. The protective measures they developed, the social networks they created, and the economic opportunities they exploited during the crisis establish patterns that influence European society for generations. Their experience demonstrates both the power of wealth to provide protection against even universal catastrophes and the psychological costs of extreme isolation, even when that isolation preserves life itself. In the quiet of their restored palaces, as normal life gradually returns to the world beyond their walls, the wealthy survivors of the plague years represent a unique form of historical witness. They experienced the Black Death not as victims, but as observers, protected by resources that allowed them to maintain detailed records and philosophical perspectives on humanity's greatest medical crisis. Their accounts provide insights into the catastrophe that complement but never quite align with the experiences of those who faced the plague without the barrier of perfumed chambers and unlimited wealth. As we reach the end of our journey through the world of medieval plague doctors and the society they served, let yourself settle more deeply into the comfort of your modern surroundings. The soft materials of your bedding, the clean air you breathe without effort, the silence unmarked by the sounds of suffering, all of these represent victories over the conditions we have explored tonight. The plague doctors with their bizarre leather costumes and herb-stuffed beaks, the learned physicians like Guy de Chauliac struggling against the inadequacy of their knowledge, the communities developing desperate new rituals of protection, and the wealthy elite isolated in their perfumed chambers. All of these represent humanity's response to a crisis that challenged every assumption about medicine, society, and survival itself. In their various ways, each group we have encountered tonight demonstrates both the resilience and the limitations of human adaptation to extreme circumstances. The plague doctors persisted in their rounds despite knowing their treatments were largely useless. Physicians like Chauliac continued their observations and experiments even as their theoretical foundations crumbled around them. Ordinary communities created entirely new forms of ritual and meaning when existing traditions proved inadequate. The wealthy used their resources to build barriers against catastrophe, though they could not entirely escape its psychological impact. What emerges from these stories is not despair, but a complex portrait of human persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. Medieval society did not collapse entirely under the weight of the Black Death, despite losing perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population. Instead, it adapted, innovated, and ultimately rebuilt itself in forms that incorporated the hard-won lessons of survival. The strange figures of the plague doctors, terrifying as they must have appeared to contemporary eyes, represent something admirable about human nature. The refusal to abandon hope, even when hope seems irrational. Their bizarre costumes and ineffective treatments were not signs of ignorance, but evidence of determination to fight against overwhelming odds with whatever tools imagination and desperation could devise. As you drift toward sleep, let your mind release these images of a more difficult time, allowing them to fade like shadows as morning light gradually illuminates a safer world. The herb-scented breathing through leather beaks, the weight of protective robes, the desperate search for effective treatments, all of these belong to a past that has taught us lessons we continue to benefit from today. In the comfortable darkness of your bedroom, surrounded by the achievements of centuries of accumulated medical knowledge and social organization, you can appreciate the distance traveled between their world and ours, the very ease with which you can seek rest, confident in your safety from the diseases that terrorized our ancestors, represents a triumph that began with the desperate innovations of medieval plague doctors and the communities they served. Sleep well, knowing that the struggles of those long-ago healers and patients contributed to building the safer world that now surrounds you with its quiet protection. Imagine yourself stepping through the heavy wooden doors of a medieval monastery, leaving behind everything you've ever known about comfort, convenience, and personal freedom. The year is 1250, and you've just taken vows that will govern every moment of your remaining days on Earth. The stone walls that surround you will become your entire universe, and the bell tower that looms above will dictate when you wake, when you pray, when you work, and when you rest. Close your eyes and feel the cool dampness of ancient stone beneath your feet. Breathe in the mingled scents of incense, parchment, and the earthy smell of herbs from the monastery garden. This is not the romanticized vision of peaceful monks you might imagine, but the raw reality of medieval monastic life, a world of rigid discipline, physical hardship, and spiritual dedication that tested the limits of human endurance. Tonight, we'll walk in the worn footsteps of those who sought salvation through suffering, who found purpose in privation, and who built some of history's most magnificent achievements while living lives of deliberate simplicity. From the bone-deep chill of pre-dawn prayers to the intricate beauty hidden within illuminated manuscripts, from the rise of ambitious abbots to the stark contrast between religious ideals and human nature. Let the steady rhythm of our exploration lull you into a state of peaceful contemplation as we uncover what it truly meant to surrender everything in pursuit of the divine. The brass bell cuts through the darkness like a blade, its urgent tolling echoing off the stone walls of your cell. It is 2 o'clock in the morning, and your body protests as you force yourself from the thin straw mattress that serves as your bed. The November air bites at your skin through the coarse wool of your habit, and your bare feet recoil from the shock of the icy stone floor. But there is no choice, no moment of hesitation allowed. The bell has spoken, and you must answer. This is Matins, the first of 8 daily prayer services that structure every moment of your existence as a Benedictine monk. As you fumble in the darkness for your sandals, you can hear the shuffling footsteps and muffled coughs of your brothers in Christ, all of them struggling against the same bone-deep weariness that clouds your mind. Sleep, that precious commodity, has been rationed to barely 4 hours, broken into fragments by the relentless demands of the divine office. You step into the corridor, joining the silent procession of shadowy figures making their way toward the chapel. The monastery is a maze of interconnected buildings, all constructed from the same grey stone that seems to absorb warmth and light, leaving behind only cold permanence. Your breath forms small clouds in the frigid air, and you pull your hood up against the draft that whistles through the narrow windows. There is no glass here, only wooden shutters that do little to keep out the elements. The chapel doors swing open, and you file into your assigned place in the choir stalls. The space is vast and echoing, designed to lift the soul toward heaven, but at this hour it feels more like a cavern. Dozens of oil lamps flicker along the walls, casting dancing shadows that make the carved stone faces of saints seem to move with a life of their own. The smell of burning oil mingles with the lingering incense from yesterday's services, creating an atmosphere thick with centuries of devotion and sacrifice. Brother Benedict, the cantor, begins the first antiphon, his voice rising in the ancient melodies of Gregorian chant. You join your voice with those of your brothers, the Latin words flowing from memory even as your mind struggles to focus through the haze of exhaustion. Domine labia mea aperies, et os meum annuntiabit laudem tuam, Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. The words have been repeated countless times, wearing grooves in your consciousness like water over stone. The service continues for nearly 2 hours, your knees growing numb against the wooden kneelers, your back aching from the rigid posture required of proper worship. Some of the older monks sway slightly, fighting against sleep that threatens to overtake them even here, in this most sacred of spaces. The youngest novices, those who have not yet learned to pace themselves through the demands of this life, occasionally nod off entirely, earning sharp glances from the abbot when their heads jerk back to wakefulness. As the final Amen echoes through the vaulted space, you might expect to return to bed, to steal a few more precious hours of rest before dawn. But this is not the way of the monastery. Instead, you file out into the cloister, that covered walkway that surrounds the central courtyard, for a period of lectio divina, divine reading. In the weak light of handheld lamps, you open your assigned text, usually scripture or the writings of the Church Fathers, and begin the slow, meditative process of spiritual study. The letters blur before your tired eyes, and you blink repeatedly, trying to focus on the words that swim across the parchment. Around you, the soft whisper of turning pages creates a gentle rhythm, punctuated by the occasional cough or shuffle of robes. The rule of silence is absolute during these hours, broken only by the most essential communications, and then only through a complex system of hand gestures that every monk must master. Your stomach begins to gnaw at itself, a familiar companion that will remain with you through most of your waking hours. The last meal was at noon yesterday, a simple affair of thin gruel, coarse bread, and perhaps a small portion of vegetables from the monastery garden. From September through Easter, you will eat only one full meal per day, supplemented by a light collation in the evening that consists of little more than bread and watered wine. Your body has learned to operate on the edge of hunger, every calorie carefully rationed, every bite a calculated necessity rather than a pleasure. The bells ring again at 4 o'clock, calling you to Lauds, the morning prayer that marks the official beginning of the monastic day. By now, the first pale light of dawn is beginning to creep through the eastern windows, casting long shadows across the stone floors. You rise from your reading, joints stiff from the cold and the hours of kneeling, and once again take your place in the choir stalls. This service is longer than matins, filled with psalms of praise and thanksgiving for the gift of another day. Your voice joins the ancient melodies, but part of your mind is already moving ahead to the tasks that await. After Lauds comes Prime, then Terce, each service bleeding into the next in an endless cycle of worship that leaves little room for individual thought or desire. Following Terce, around 9 in the morning, you finally receive permission to break your fast. The refectory, the communal dining hall, is a long, narrow room lined with rough wooden tables and benches. You take your assigned seat and wait in silence as one of the younger monks begins the daily reading from Scripture or the lives of the saints. His voice carries across the room as you eat your meager breakfast, a bowl of thin porridge, a small piece of bread, and a cup of ale so weak it barely deserves the name. The porridge is often gritty with impurities in the grain, and the bread is dark and coarse, filled with chaff that catches in your teeth. But you eat every morsel with gratitude, knowing that this simple meal represents more food than many in the world beyond these walls will see in a day. The ale, at least, is safer than the water, which often carries disease and death in its murky depths. As the reader's voice drones on, you catch glimpses of your fellow monks around the long tables. Brother Thomas, who entered the monastery as a young man full of religious fervor, now bears the hollow-eyed look of someone who has been worn down by years of privation and hard labor. His hands are permanently stained with ink from his work in the scriptorium, and his shoulders are bent from countless hours hunched over manuscripts. Brother Peter, once a knight who gave up his lands and titles to serve God, moves with the careful deliberation of a man whose body has been broken by decades of sleeping on stone floors and rising before dawn. The faces around you tell stories of sacrifice that go far beyond the obvious privations of monastic life. These are men who have given up not just wealth and comfort, but the fundamental human experiences of family, romantic love, and personal freedom. Some, you can see in their eyes, have found the peace they sought in this surrender. Others bear the weight of a choice they can never unmake, bound by vows that will hold them until death. After the morning meal, the bell rings for the work period that will occupy most of your day. The Benedictine motto, ora et labora, pray and work, is not merely a philosophical ideal, but a grueling reality that shapes every waking hour. You are assigned to the fields today, joining a group of brothers who will spend the next 8 hours in backbreaking agricultural labor. The monastery must be largely self-sufficient, producing its own food, crafting its own tools, and maintaining its own buildings. This means that every monk, regardless of his background or education, must become intimately familiar with the rhythm of physical work. Your hands, once soft if you came from noble birth, are now calloused and permanently stained with soil. Your back has learned to bend to the plow, your arms to swing the scythe, your legs to carry you through endless rows of crops. Today, you work in the wheat fields, harvesting the grain that will become the bread that sustains your community through the coming winter. The work is rhythmic and meditative in its own way, but it is also relentless. The sun beats down on your woolen habit, causing sweat to pool beneath the heavy fabric, but you cannot remove it. Modesty and humility require that your body remain covered at all times, even when engaged in the most strenuous labor. Your fellow workers move in practiced silence, communicating only when absolutely necessary through the hand signals that have become second nature. The swish of scythes through grain creates its own music, punctuated by the distant sound of the monastery bells marking the passage of time. Every few hours, work stops for another service, sext at noon, none in mid-afternoon. Brief interludes of worship that break the labor into manageable segments while ensuring that the spiritual life takes precedence over all worldly concerns. The harvest work reveals the full extent of your community's dependence on manual labor. Without the benefit of modern machinery or even efficient animal power, the monastery owns only a few oxen and horses, jealously guarded and carefully maintained. Everything must be accomplished through human effort. Seeds are planted by hand, crops are tended with simple tools, and the harvest is gathered through the coordinated effort of dozens of men working in careful synchronization. Your hands blister and bleed, but you continue working. This is part of the discipline, part of the spiritual formation that monastery life is designed to provide. Through physical hardship, the theory goes, the soul is purified and brought closer to God. Through the surrender of personal comfort, the monk learns to find his identity not in worldly success or physical pleasure, but in spiritual growth and community service. As the afternoon wears on, your body begins to rebel against the constant demands placed upon it. Your shoulders ache from the repetitive motion of harvesting, your lower back sends sharp spikes of pain with each bend, and your feet, despite their leather sandals, are blistered from hours of walking on rough ground. But these physical discomforts pale in comparison to the deeper challenges of monastic life, the gradual erosion of individual identity, the constant struggle to maintain spiritual focus in the face of human weakness, the growing awareness that this chosen path demands everything you have to give and more. The dinner bell finally rings as shadows begin to lengthen across the monastery grounds. You join the procession back to the refectory, your body exhausted, but your day far from over. The evening meal is slightly more substantial than breakfast, perhaps some vegetables from the garden, a small portion of fish if it's not a fasting day, and the same coarse bread that has become as familiar as your own breathing. The reader continues his recitation as you eat, the Latin words washing over you like water over stone, wearing away at your consciousness until only the most essential elements remain. After dinner comes Vespers, the evening prayer service that marks the beginning of the monastery's transition toward night. Your voice joins the familiar melodies, but exhaustion makes concentration difficult. Some of the brothers sway gently in their stalls, fighting the sleep that pulls at their eyelids like weights. The abbot's watchful gaze moves constantly across the assembled monks, noting those who struggle to maintain proper attention and deportment. The service concludes as full darkness settles over the monastery grounds. You have one final obligation before sleep: Compline, the night prayer that officially ends the monastic day. This briefest of services is also the most intimate, a quiet gathering in the small hours that prepares the community for rest and the inevitable repetition of the cycle that will begin again in just a few short hours. As you finally return to your cell, your entire body aches with a weariness that penetrates to the bone. The straw mattress, thin and lumpy as it is, feels like the greatest luxury imaginable. You pull the rough wool blanket up to your chin and close your eyes, knowing that in less than 4 hours the bell will ring again and this entire demanding routine will begin anew. In the darkness, you can hear the subtle sounds of a community settling into sleep, the creak of straw mattresses, the soft whisper of breathing, the occasional cough or movement from neighboring cells. These are the men who have chosen to live this life, who have surrendered everything in pursuit of something greater than worldly comfort or personal ambition. Some sleep peacefully, having found in this harsh routine the spiritual fulfillment they sought. Others lie awake, wrestling with doubts and regrets that no amount of prayer seems able to quiet. This is the reality of medieval monastic life, not the peaceful, contemplative existence that popular imagination often conjures, but a grueling test of physical endurance and spiritual commitment. It is a life that breaks some men while transforming others, that demands everything while promising rewards that can only be measured in terms of faith and hope. Tomorrow will bring the same bells, the same prayers, the same back-breaking work, and the same struggle to find meaning and purpose in the deliberate embrace of hardship. The monastery sleeps, but its rhythm continues, marked by the steady passage of time and the unwavering commitment of men who have chosen to live by rules that most would find impossible to endure. As the monastery settles into its nightly rhythm of rest and prayer, let your mind drift forward from the austere cells and simple chapels we have just explored toward a very different kind of religious institution. Imagine yourself traveling north from the countryside, approaching the outskirts of Paris in the year 1122, where the spires of a great abbey rise against the sky, like fingers reaching toward heaven itself. This is Saint-Denis, the royal abbey of France, and at its helm stands a man whose vision will transform not only his own monastery, but the very nature of sacred architecture throughout Europe. His name is Suger. And though he began his life in circumstances as humble as any of the monks we have observed, his story will reveal how ambition, politics, and spiritual devotion could intertwine in the complex web of medieval power. Suger was born around 1081 to a family of modest means, peasant stock who worked the lands surrounding the Abbey of Saint-Denis. In an age when birth determined destiny, with the inevitability of sunrise, his parents made a choice that would alter the course of both their son's life and the history of art itself. They offered young Suger as an oblate to the monastery, surrendering their child to God's service in the hope that education and religious life would provide opportunities that their humble circumstances could never afford. Picture the boy Suger, perhaps 10 years old, walking through the same heavy wooden doors that had admitted countless others seeking refuge from the world's harsh realities. But unlike many who entered monastic life as an escape from worldly concerns, Suger carried within him an innate understanding of power and its uses. Even in the structured environment of Saint-Denis, with its bells and prayers and endless cycles of work, his mind was already calculating, observing, learning the intricate dance of influence that governed both church and state. The Abbey of Saint-Denis was no ordinary monastery. Founded on the legendary burial site of Saint-Denis, the patron saint of France, it had become the traditional resting place of French kings and queens. The Capetian dynasty, which had recently secured its hold on the French throne, looked to Saint-Denis not merely as a religious institution, but as a symbol of royal legitimacy and divine approval. Within these walls lay the earthly remains of Charlemagne's descendants, the Carolingian kings, whose memory still cast long shadows over European politics. As a student in the Abbey school, young Suger found himself sharing lessons with another boy who would profoundly shape his future, Louis, son of King Philip I of France. The friendship that developed between the peasant's son and the future monarch was unusual for its time, a relationship that crossed the rigid boundaries of medieval social hierarchy. They studied together under the patient instruction of the Abbey's masters, learning Latin grammar and rhetoric, absorbing the classics of Christian theology, and developing the intellectual foundation that would serve them both in the complex world of 12th century politics. But even as Suger excelled in his studies and embraced the religious life that had been chosen for him, his true genius lay not in contemplation, but in administration. He possessed that rare combination of spiritual devotion and practical acumen that would allow him to navigate the treacherous waters of church politics while never losing sight of his ultimate goal, the glorification of God through the aggrandizement of Saint-Denis. In 1106, when Suger was still a young monk, his childhood friend Louis ascended the throne as Louis VI of France. The new king faced immediate challenges from rebellious nobles who questioned his authority and sought to fragment the kingdom into competing fiefdoms. It was during this crisis that Suger first demonstrated his political skills, serving as an intermediary between the monastery and the royal court, helping to secure the abbey's continued prosperity while supporting his friend's efforts to consolidate royal power. Suger's rise within the monastic hierarchy was steady, but not without controversy. Some of his fellow monks viewed his worldly connections with suspicion, questioning whether his frequent involvement in political affairs was compatible with the Benedictine ideal of withdrawal from secular concerns. The tension between contemplative spirituality and active engagement with worldly power would define much of Suger's career, creating a constant undercurrent of criticism from those who believed that true holiness required complete separation from political ambition. In 1122, after years of careful maneuvering and demonstrated competence, Suger was elected abbot of Saint-Denis. He was 41 years old, at the height of his intellectual powers, and surrounded by a kingdom that was finally beginning to stabilize under his friend's increasingly effective rule. The position of abbot at Saint-Denis was among the most prestigious religious offices in France, carrying with it not only spiritual authority, but also significant temporal power, including control over vast estates and the income they generated. One of Suger's first challenges as abbot was to address the physical deterioration of the abbey church itself. The Carolingian structure, built centuries earlier, was showing its age in ways that went beyond mere aesthetic concerns. The walls were cracking, the roof leaked during heavy rains, and the narrow windows allowed so little light to penetrate that the interior remained perpetually dim, even during the brightest days. But Suger saw in this necessary renovation an opportunity to create something unprecedented, a new kind of sacred space that would serve as a magnificent setting for royal ceremonies while advancing his own theological vision of divine light. The reconstruction of Saint-Denis began in earnest around 1135, and from its earliest stages it was clear that this would be no ordinary renovation. Suger had traveled extensively throughout France and beyond, studying architectural innovations, observing the latest developments in stone carving and window craft, and formulating a comprehensive vision that would integrate all of these elements into a coherent whole. He was particularly fascinated by the technical innovations that were beginning to appear in Norman and Burgundian churches. The pointed arch that could span greater distances than the traditional rounded arch, the ribbed vault that could distribute weight more efficiently, and the flying buttress that could support walls while allowing them to reach unprecedented heights. But Suger's architectural innovations were driven by more than mere technical curiosity. He had developed a sophisticated theology of light based on the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, which held that divine truth could be apprehended through contemplation of physical beauty and luminosity. In this theological framework, the church building itself became a kind of scripture written in stone and glass, a physical manifestation of spiritual reality that could lift the soul toward God through sensory experience. The western facade of the new church, completed around 1140, announced Suger's revolutionary approach to sacred architecture. Instead of the solid, fortress-like walls that characterized earlier Romanesque churches, Saint-Denis presented a face to the world that was perforated with openings, decorated with intricate sculptural programs, and topped with towers that seemed to dissolve upward into light and air. The famous rose window, perhaps the first of its kind, served as both a practical source of illumination and a theological statement about the divine nature of light itself. Inside the church, visitors encountered space unlike anything they had previously experienced. The nave soared upward to heights that seemed to defy the laws of physics, supported by a system of stone ribs and external buttresses that created an impression of weightlessness. Most dramatically of all, the walls themselves seemed to disappear, replaced by vast expanses of colored glass that transformed sunlight into a shower of jeweled radiance that played across every surface. The stained glass windows at Saint-Denis were not merely decorative elements, but integral components of Suger's theological program. Each window told stories from Scripture and the lives of the saints, but they did so through a medium that was itself miraculous. Light transformed into color, transparency made solid, the immaterial given physical form. When sunlight streamed through these windows, it carried with it not just illumination, but spiritual meaning, creating an environment where the boundary between earth and heaven seemed permeable. Suger documented his architectural achievements with the pride of a man who knew he had accomplished something revolutionary. In his written account of the church's reconstruction, he described his innovations with the enthusiasm of both an artist and a theologian, explaining how each element contributed to the overall effect of lifting worshippers out of their earthly concerns and into direct contemplation of divine reality. He was particularly proud of the church's acoustical properties, noting how the soaring spaces and hard stone surfaces created a reverberant environment that made even simple chanted prayers seem to echo with heavenly voices. The completion of Saint-Denis coincided with a period of unprecedented prosperity and influence for both the abbey and its abbot. King Louis VII, who had inherited the throne from his father in 1137, relied heavily on Suger's counsel in matters both secular and spiritual. When the king departed for the Second Crusade in 1147, he entrusted the regency of France to Suger, making a peasant's son the effective ruler of the most powerful kingdom in Europe. Suger's regency, which lasted from 1147 to 1149, demonstrated his remarkable ability to balance competing interests while maintaining the stability that Louis VI had worked so hard to establish. He managed the kingdom's finances, with the same attention to detail that he had brought to the reconstruction of his abbey, ensuring that royal revenues continued to flow while avoiding the excessive taxation that might provoke rebellion. He negotiated with fractious nobles, mediated disputes between competing bishops, and maintained diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms, all while overseeing the continued prosperity of Saint-Denis. But success brought its own challenges, and Suger's later years were marked by increasing tension between his worldly achievements and the spiritual ideals that had originally drawn him to monastic life. Bernard of Clairvaux, perhaps the most influential religious figure of the 12th century, had long been critical of what he saw as excessive luxury and ostentation in church decoration. In his famous Apologia, Bernard specifically attacked abbots who surrounded themselves with artistic magnificence while their monks lived in poverty, arguing that true devotion required simplicity and austerity rather than sensory stimulation. Though Bernard never mentioned Suger by name, many contemporaries understood his criticism as directed at Saint-Denis and its ambitious abbot. The debate between these two towering figures of medieval monasticism reflected a fundamental tension within Christian thought. Should the Church embrace beauty and artistic excellence as means of approaching the divine, or did such worldly splendor distract from the spiritual poverty that Christ himself had preached and exemplified? Suger defended his artistic program with characteristic eloquence, arguing that magnificent churches served not the vanity of their builders, but the glory of God himself. He pointed to the scriptural precedent of Solomon's temple, with its gold and precious stones and elaborate decorative programs, as evidence that God approved of beauty when it was dedicated to divine worship. He also noted the practical benefits of architectural magnificence, observing how the beauty of Saint-Denis attracted pilgrims from throughout Europe, bringing both spiritual benefit and material prosperity to the surrounding region. The controversy surrounding Suger's architectural innovations reflects the broader changes that were transforming European society in the 12th century. The economic revival that followed centuries of relative stagnation had created new sources of wealth and new classes of people who were eager to express their prosperity through artistic patronage. The intellectual renaissance that accompanied this economic growth had reintroduced classical learning and stimulated new forms of theological speculation. The political consolidation achieved by monarchs like Louis XVI had created stable conditions that allowed for ambitious, long-term projects. Suger died in 1151 at the age of 70, having lived to see his architectural innovations copied throughout Europe. The Gothic style, as later historians would name it, spread rapidly from Saint-Denis to cathedrals and churches across France and beyond, creating a new visual language for Christian worship that emphasized height, light, and the dissolution of solid barriers between earth and heaven. Chartres, Reims, Amiens, and countless other great churches would follow the precedent that Suger had established, each adding its own innovations to the architectural vocabulary he had pioneered. But Suger's legacy extended beyond architecture to encompass a fundamental redefinition of the relationship between spiritual devotion and worldly engagement. He had demonstrated that it was possible for a deeply religious person to achieve great things in the secular sphere without compromising his ultimate commitment to God's service. His success as both abbot and royal counselor provided a model for later generations of churchmen who would play crucial roles in the development of European civilization. The man who had entered Saint-Denis as a peasant's son had transformed not only his own institution, but the very conception of what sacred space could be. He had taken the architectural innovations of his time and synthesized them into something entirely new, creating buildings that seemed to embody the theological principles he held most dear. He had navigated the complex world of medieval politics with skill and integrity, proving that religious commitment and practical effectiveness could reinforce rather than undermine each other. As night settles over the Abbey of Saint-Denis, imagine the great church that Chauliac built, standing silent in the darkness. The rose window, which blazes with color during the daylight hours, now appears as a dark circle against the western facade. The soaring interior spaces, so filled with light and movement during the day, have become caverns of shadow and stillness. But even in darkness, the building retains its power to inspire and uplift, its very proportions speaking of humanity's eternal desire to transcend the limitations of earthly existence and approach the divine through beauty, dedication, and the careful application of human skill to sacred purposes. Tomorrow, when dawn breaks over the Abbey grounds, sunlight will once again stream through those revolutionary windows, transforming the interior into the jeweled paradise that Chauliac envisioned. Pilgrims will gather to marvel at what human hands have accomplished in God's honor, and the cycle of prayer and worship that has continued for centuries will begin anew, carried forward in spaces that embody both the highest artistic achievements of their age and the timeless human longing for connection with the transcendent.